Hi, everyone. It's Janice from the Divorcing Religion podcast. I'm excited to tell you that my book is now for sale. It's called Divorcing Religion, a memoir and survival handbook. And I'll make sure you have a link in the notes for that. And also, I want to encourage you to like, subscribe, and become a member of my YouTube channel. Take care. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Divorcing Religion podcast. I'm your host, Janice SELBIE. I'm a registered professional counselor and a religious trauma recovery coach. My guest today is a repeat guest. She's joined me before on the Divorcing Religion podcast, and she gave a wonderful talk at the conference on religious trauma a few years ago. Today, I'm speaking with Emily Hedrick. Emily is a resilience coach specializing in religious trauma and compassion fatigue. Former Mennonite pastor, she holds an M.Div, is an ICF-accredited coach, and is a certified forward-facing coach. Emily's work helps people rediscover wholeness after religious harm through somatic practices and practical resilience skills, which I definitely want to hear more about. She is the author of How to Treat Your Body Like a Sacred Text and True Confessions of a God Killer, Postmodern Pilgrim's Progress. Emily's expertise in trauma recovery, body-based practices, and navigating the impact of toxic religion equips her to empower readers to live beyond burnout and embrace a more meaningful life. Emily, I'm so glad to see you again and so happy to have you back on the show.
I'm so glad to be here.
And you've written another book, and that is super exciting. As you know, I also just published a book, so we are definitely going to get into talking about that. I was hoping first you might tell us a little bit about your childhood, because I know one of the things you mentioned is a theologically toxic childhood. So what was it like for you growing up, and kind of what got you from there to here?
Yeah, so I grew up Mennonite, and that can mean so many different things. So for quite some time, I didn't think that I grew up evangelical, and then I started talking to people who did and was like, oh, no, that was me too. And so part of what made that theologically toxic for me was how fundamentalism had crept into the Mennonite church the way it did many different denominations in the 1920s, and then just kept going. And so there were a mix of people I grew up with, but some of the strongest voices in my religious experiences and educations were ones that had their truth claims decided, and everything was about defending them. And they happened to be truth claims that were very scary, like, if you don't follow the rules of our religion, including having the beliefs, you're going to go to hell. And then as things continued, like the rapture isn't necessarily 1920s fundamentalism, but it came through real hard with Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins in the Left Behind series. So we were all into those growing up. That added some more fun stuff. And it just made things really scary, especially because I was the kind of kid that would take things very seriously instead of just being like, this is boring, I don't care. So it tends to be those of us that take things seriously that seem to get burned the most by toxic religious environments.
Yes, can totally relate to that. And then, so not only were you exposed to those things, but then you went on to actually get your Master's of Divinity. So you took it like super seriously.
Yeah, I did. And really, as I look back on it now, I recognize that was my way of surviving. I couldn't comprehend a world in which I wasn't in a Christian tradition. And so if I was going to be safe, I might as well be a person with power in it. And there were things about it that really helped. And then I think what a lot of women that go into pastoring begin to experience in their first few years and then throughout the rest of their careers is, oh, I'm still a woman. I didn't realize. So I do think I wouldn't have had the words to articulate this at the time, but one of the reasons I wanted to be a pastor was because I wanted to be treated like a man. And
Mhm.
that wasn't going to happen.
Oh, that is so interesting. That hits me really hard because I think that's probably very accurate for a lot of women who do go into it. Totally makes sense because we grew up in a situation where we were taught that we were less
Hmm.
than a man because we didn't have the same equipment. So, did you still have all your faith in the same way by the time you graduated with your master's in divinity? No.
No. I mean, I wrote True Confessions of a God Killer, which is basically me saying I chose to stop believing in God on purpose when I was 20. And so it, what religious education ended up offering me was more tools, more understanding, lots of critical thinking skills, but also there was still this sense of calling not from God, but to caring for the community. And so I walked in, I don't know. The other thing is, if you go far enough in religious education, like atheist is a weird word, like which God don't you believe in? And there are so many different ways of thinking about this. And what if you consider God to be symbol and you start looking at poetry and how people use language to talk about real things? It becomes very nebulous space. So I think when I was pastoring, I definitely was quite clear that I did not believe in God all the time, that I might have a moment where I might believe for, I don't know, a few seconds and then move on with my life, that I was there for the community and for the practice of
Wow.
trying to be good people in the world.
Wow, that is so earnest and surprising. I feel like when I think of my experience in a lot of Pentecostal and charismatic churches, it's, as a pastor, you have to sign this paperwork, this doctrine, this faith thing saying, yeah, I definitely believe, and yes, I do this, and no, I don't do that. And you were able to actually say, you know what, I don't fit into the boxes that you might have for me, and you still got hired on.
Yeah, they actually read True Confessions of a God Killer before they hired me.
Well, that's a pretty progressive, open-minded thing to do. It
Yeah.
sounds like so. And then, did you pastor for a few years, or how did that go?
Yeah, I pastored for almost 4 years before I ended up burning out. Yeah.
And when I think of pastors burning out, I think there's so many reasons for it because pastors are under a huge amount of stress.
Hmm.
Um, was part of it that you couldn't make things fit theologically?
Yeah, well, it was a mix of things. So the congregation I pastored was actually quite diverse theologically, and I loved that about them. And one of the interesting conversations I got into when I was looking at different churches was this question of, can you handle a congregation that has both progressive and conservative thinking in it? Because a lot of people that grew up in progressive churches, because the Mennonite church does have, like, you can have an experience in the Mennonite church where you grow up progressive, oriented toward social justice, not as obsessed with the belief system. Like, that's possible. That was not my experience. But sometimes that can create a very intense intolerance toward conservative theology and kind of not wanting to empathize with it at all. And that can make it hard to pastor then. Um, for me, I was so used to holding everything because I had experienced, even like, I would even call my parents somewhat progressive. Even growing up, they've gone even further, I think, in it toward the progressive side of things since we've all gotten older. But even growing up, they were more progressive than a lot of the people we hung out with. So I was used to that. And I thought that I could hold that. And I started pastoring in the middle of nowhere, Ohio in June of 2016. So there were,
Oh boy.
yeah. Um, yeah.
So, and that, of course, if I'm remembering correctly, for the United States, that's also Trump was in power for the first time. I'm sorry to even say his name, but so that really would also create strife potentially in a religious setting.
Yes. And I was naive at the time. I like, it was because I was so about the community. I cared about what the community did and what values they brought with them to the ballot box. Even though technically as a pastor, you don't tell people how to vote, you can champion values. And I genuinely believed that the entire church, maybe minus an outlier or two, would be voting Democratic Party or independent because
that's the most like Jesus.
Right. Like, and also I grew up with a really intense purity culture, which at that time I understood to mean you draw the line at sexual infidelity of any kind. And if Trump is grabbing women by the pussy, there's no way a Christian, especially a conservative one, could be okay with that. And so I didn't expect them to like the voting process, but I figured it was much more straightforward. So it was a genuine, like, rug pulled out from underneath me. And having to preach the Sunday after the election, it was just, yeah. Yeah, it was really hard.
Wow. So is that part of what led to the burnout or to you leaving?
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah, it was this. I think I put a lot of pressure on the community because I didn't have a God. And so the community failing in that way to me, and it wasn't about like needing to be a Democrat. It was just about, can you take a stand against things that you don't believe in? And so that really threw me. It really made me question, like, wait, is there any good in what I'm doing here if this is possible, if people are not being held to the standards of these values?
No, it's like a profound disappointment and shock.
Yeah.
Like you said, the rug being pulled out from under you.
Yeah. And I think a lot of it just kept getting worse over time. I remember different conversations emerging when Brett Kavanaugh was on the stand for becoming a Supreme Court justice, and how it became so clear to me that people did not care about women's safety. And to see that, like, as I left, I got a little bit more of a read on some of the patterns and systems, and oh yeah, we could have predicted that nobody would care about women's safety. But I went in so bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and hopeful and like, oh, but no, all of these people mean well. And I think they still do. That almost makes it scarier. But it just, the system that was supposed to be creating the standards for a group was just not working.
Wait, so then what did you do? You leave the congregation and you're trying to figure stuff out. What did you do after?
Yeah. Well, I found Marlene.
Yes.
Yeah.
Please talk about that. That's how we know each other, through Dr. Marlene Winnell.
Yeah. So actually, like, I will give a lot of credit. I have lots of critiques on MCUSA, Mennonite Church USA, but I will give a lot of credit to, like, there are many things that they do try to do well and try to offer support. So they knew I was struggling. I had lots of conversations with the conference minister about what was going on. And one of the things they offered was money for me to get help.
Wow,
and so
nice
they
support.
actually, yes. So the sessions I had with Marlene were paid for by the church.
Wow.
And
that's great.
And what I didn't expect to come out of that, initially in my consultation with her, I was like, well, who's doing the work with religious trauma? Because this matters to me. It mattered to me when I was pastoring too. And to have her acknowledge that I would be eligible to do that because of some of the training I've had both in coaching and also in the pastoral care area was really empowering. I kind of thought I was going to have to turn into a clinician to work with religious trauma, and that didn't end up being the case. And she really gave me the self-confidence, and also worked with me and taught me things, and supervised some of my initial clients. So it was a really big deal, both to connect with her, to be validated by her, and then also to learn from her.
Right. And so I'll mention Dr. Winnell's book is called Leaving the Fold. And really, it's one of the very early works in the field of religious trauma recovery.
Yeah.
She's really kind of a pioneer in the field. And you and I met through her group called Journey Free. And Journey Free is
Yes.
still going on today. So Marlene was able to work with you around the idea of religious trauma and religious trauma syndrome, and let you know that you are capable of working with this demographic of people who have been harmed
Yes.
by religion, even though we certainly know that not everyone who has grown up religious or is religious, they don't all see or feel that they have been harmed by religion or suffered trauma. So one thing, I did want to ask you about in our introduction. So you talked about working with Marlene, and yes, you can work with clients. What is it to be a forward-facing coach? Talk a little bit about that.
Yes, thank you for asking about that. Yeah, and actually that was step next because Marlene introduced me to forward facing. So forward facing is an approach to trauma recovery created by Dr. Eric Gentry. And the reason why Marlene introduced it to me is that the approach with trauma is to stay in the present and looking toward the future rather than going back to memories. And so that puts it in a category of skill building that is accessible in a coaching scope of practice, in addition to, like, therapists do everything coaches do too. It's just, yeah. So, so I did some training with them, both in the realm of the professional resilience side of things, that's the compassion fatigue stuff, but then also in personal experiences of trauma where I see the religious trauma stuff. And so forward facing, what I work with clients to do is learning how their nervous system works and what it takes to communicate with their bodies in real time as they're living their lives. And so what I loved about it was that I was very resistant to a lot of different trauma modalities when I initially got out. And part of that was because they feel kind of spiritual sometimes. And you're putting a lot of trust in an authority figure. And what forward facing does is they give you psychoeducation first. And they're like, hey, go check us. Like, go look up our sources, see if this is real. And then provide practices that you do yourself. And so if it doesn't work, don't do it.
So
And
is this where the neuroscience piece and the somatic piece come into
yes,
play?
yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So the neuroscience, some of it is very familiar to anybody that's trained in mental health. I would say today I'm coming to the crux of it being reciprocal inhibition, which is that you can't be stressed and relaxed at the same time. And what is trauma? Trauma is stress. And so some of these big binary ideas can actually be very helpful at first, learning these things, like you can't have trauma in a relaxed body, which means that if you learn how to relax your body regularly in real time, then you're already working on the recovery process of trauma. And learning how to relax your body in moments when you do get triggered, but you're not in danger, is the meat of it. That's
Wow.
yeah.
And the other word that you've mentioned, resilience. So we're talking about things in a religious trauma context, but it's almost impossible to be talking about these things without the overarching political situation. Like everybody
Yes.
right now, I feel like everyone around the world, but particularly in the United States and
Yes.
Canada, we're in a sense all being held hostage by someone whose modus operandi is to keep everyone off balance and in a chronic state of anxiety and stress so that they don't know what's coming. So we could all use some help right now, I feel, with resiliency and somatic, kind of body practical ways that we can calm or restore the nervous system. Are you, without giving too much away from your book, can you tell us about some maybe common ways that you work with clients to help them in that regard?
Absolutely. Step one is what I've just mentioned, is learning how to relax your body in everyday life. And so it's not like full on, let's go into a completely dissociated state of I'm imagining the ocean, but more of I'm here, I'm present with you. And even now in this moment, I have a bit of perceived threat about performing in front of people that will see this, who knows how many. And I also know I'm not in danger in this moment. And so I'm relaxing my body even now. That's step one. But I think because of the political environment we are in this moment, I've become even more aware of how important step two is. And that's intentionality. And it's basically choosing your focus for your life. And there are a variety of different ways that you could do that. Some people will choose a focus for a particular sphere of life. So choosing where I'm going to put my political focus is definitely going to help me in the world that is just throwing information at me all the time. And me having that sympathetic nervous system, the fight flight response of, well, I got to do something, I got to do something, I got to do something. And if I've already chosen my focus and said, okay, today I am focused on calling reps and that's it, then it's not as much of this overwhelm, because I've decided and I'm not stuck in that space of, oh no, what do I do? Panic. So the other thing that has been helping me think about this, because one of Dr. Gentry's classic things when he teaches is to ask people if they're 100% safe right now. And that is not a fun conversation in this political climate. And so one of the things that I have done in trying to better understand his approach is go back to read his favorite people. And one of them includes Viktor Frankl, The Man's Search for Meaning. And what really hit me my second time through that book was that even in a concentration camp, Frankl knew what he wanted to do with his time. He wanted to continue studying what it meant to be human. And so even though he was captive, and it was terrible, like not minimizing what he experienced, but part of what allowed him to be as resilient as he was that focus of, sure, I may not be here of my own free will, but I am going to choose what I am going to be paying attention to. And so in our spectrum now, I sometimes talk about a spectrum I've created in my mind. So in the professional resilience space, we talk about people that choose to be in horrific situations in order to be helpers, and how bodies can sometimes get confused about whether the horrific situation is happening to them or if they've decided to be there as part of their job role. And so if you think about someone that works in an emergency room, they are safe as they do their job, but they see a lot of people in a lot of danger. And so that's one level of control that is important to acknowledge when we do professional work as helpers. And then there's Viktor Frankl deciding to keep being a psychologist in a concentration camp. And we're somewhere in the middle here. Like, pick where you are in the spectrum of many of us have not chosen this political situation. And even the people who voted for the current administration were not necessarily signing up for all of these details. And so figuring out, where is my agency, even in this? I'm going to stay focused on that, is part of what creates something that's bearable.
And that's definitely no small task for those of us who grew up without a sense of agency. If we grew up in fundamentalist religious homes and we were taught that that God is invasive. There's no privacy, even in our minds. We can't get away from this God who knows all our thoughts. And then, of course, we have to obey our parents, obey our pastor. If you're a woman, obey your husband. So the idea of agency is missing from at least from the Abrahamic religions. So you even bringing up the word agency, and that you're helping clients to understand agency and learn about it and embrace it for themselves. That seems like a really big step for people.
Yeah. Yeah. It is a really big deal. And it's very empowering to be able to claim that and claim it and go.
Yeah. Yeah. So are those kind of the main steps or the framework that you take people through when they're working with you on forward-facing trauma recovery?
Yes. First is learning to communicate with the body. Second is being able to apply it in such a way that they are able to claim that agency for themselves. And it's a process. It's a learning process. It's go out, try it, see what works, what doesn't, come back, we'll troubleshoot. And, I'm still in that process now. I currently have an alumni group going for people that have worked with me that have done this, whether in group or one-on-one. And I report in every week. Here's what's working, here's what's not. And I think it is a simple approach in many ways, but it takes a long time to master it. Probably an entire lifetime, really. But the benefits from just starting are enough that it's worth it.
And I'm wondering, so we spoke earlier about some folks don't recognize even that they are carrying trauma from religious experiences or from whatever experiences. I wonder, why do you think people kind of overlook their own trauma? And also, how can people recognize it if they are carrying trauma in their body?
Yeah, I think our lack of really, really clear clinical diagnoses directly related to religious experiences creating trauma has been a big part of it, because it means that the way we talk about trauma and the things that count for trauma don't always get into that category. And for many people, I talk about this in my book, when I was first learning about compassion fatigue, one half of compassion fatigue is secondary trauma. And most of the time people associate that with people in helping professions. But the idea behind secondary trauma is that witnessing someone else or just hearing the story of someone else's life-threatening experiences is enough for a body to encode threat with stimulus related to that story. And think of all the stories we tell in religious settings. I think while people do have immediate experiences that are horrific in religious settings, I think a large amount of religious trauma is secondary. And as a result of that, people can be walking around like, well, nothing happened to me, nothing happened to me, nothing happened to me. But I heard the story of Ananias and Sapphira 50 times as a kid. And they got struck by lightning for not giving money. Like, it's, well, not struck by lightning. Sorry. Need to be a good Bible scholar. They got struck down. They got struck down by God. But, so how many other stories like that are there? That one's the scariest for me because it's in the New Testament. But, yeah. And then not just those stories, not just scriptural stories, but the stories that everybody in the fold tells about the people that left the fold or before they were in the fold, about how terrible life is if you don't do everything the way that you're supposed to in the group.
Yeah. And
it's
then even the idea of how we are supposed to maintain the belief that God is, a loving God, but that also he might command that you sacrifice your son on an altar or something like that. I just feel like there's so much, there has to be an element of disconnect
Right.
there because it's
Yes.
so horrifying, the story, or Lot offering his daughters, to the mob. How is that okay? And how can Christians? I remember just like glossing over that, or even asking my own parents when I was growing up. Oh yeah, we don't really think about that one too much. It's because it's too upsetting, but it really is traumatizing on a level to be told those stories and to be told that they are true, not just that they are, made up or mythology or whatever. That's
Yes.
hard to come to terms with.
And in a community, if you're in a fundamentalist community that is constantly talking about how scripture is supposed to be taken so seriously and not given any tools to interact with these stories in much more wholesome ways than just, well, here it is. It's real. Good luck.
That's exactly how it comes from the pulpit. You're right.
Yes.
That's exactly what it is. There's like no protections around it. So no wonder a lot of us are traumatized. How can people maybe who don't recognize that, how can people tell in their own body? What are some of the signs if they are carrying trauma?
Yeah. So I think one of the biggest, okay, if we're going to go really simple, really precise, are you tensing up your muscles in situations that aren't dangerous? Because that's going to be a sign of trauma of some sort, painful past learning that is informing your procedural memory to try and protect you from stuff that you don't need protected from. But when it comes to some of the hallmarks of religious trauma, I would say religious trauma is relational trauma because we're sharing these stories and experiences with a group. The expectations are coming from the group. It's about belonging. It's about worthiness. It's about love. And so that often translates into appeasing behaviors in everyday life. One of the things I like to say is if you can read the room better than you can read yourself, that's a key sign that you have adapted to being able to please someone, whether it's the deity or the people in the religious community or your parents, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
If it's easier for you to know how other people are feeling and what they need than to know how you're feeling and what you need, key indicator.
Right. And whenever people love to label themselves and tell me that they're an empath. And as soon as I hear that, I think, oh, that means at some point you learned you had to be able to read the room for your own safety. And so you may have become skilled at picking up on cues from other people emotionally as to how they're doing. But that in itself, if you feel like you're a really empathic type of person, take a look at the roots of that, how that might or why that might have developed for you as a skill. It's a coping mechanism.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think in some spiritual communities, people can pull it out and call it a spiritual gift. And then it becomes the onus on you to use it. And that's great if it's a choice, but if it's at the expense of knowing what you need and asking for that, it's going to hurt. It's going to hurt long term.
Mm-hmm.
I have a few different friends with complex trauma or relational trauma. And one of the things I love when I get together with them is that we are all super hospitable. We're like we're taking care of each other. And over time, I've learned how to parse through, okay, am I taking care of this person because I think they're going to hate me and I'm going to die? Or am I taking care of this person because I want to? And it's so lovely to be able to do it because you want to. And it's so great to be able to tap into the skills and be like, I know how to read the room and I'm going to choose to do it today. And then also be able to go back to, I know how to read the room and I don't feel like it.
Right. And I feel like it's also easy for us to get into relational dynamics where we are always viewed as the caregiver, caretaker, the nurturer, the one who is always cares, and trying to smooth things out, that can become quite burdensome. And then people can get uncomfortable, feel uncomfortable when we're the ones who are having a need. And we need other people to step up and comfort us. And, that's people don't like that if that's not the role situation that they're used to. So I really like the idea of getting to know ourselves very well and even asking ourselves, why am I doing this?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's can be hard and uncomfortable for people to do. And like I said, if the relationship roles are kind of entrenched, it can be uncomfortable for everyone, but it's still worth pursuing to find out about ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
I had another question here. I wrote some of my questions down for you.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Tell us about, and this has to do with your new book. Tell us about the dysregulated collective and the idea that everything happened to everyone. And again, I'm thinking of it in religious terms, but also in the broader terms, politically, right now, everything is happening to everyone. So if you would tell us a little bit about the dysregulated collective.
Yeah. So in chapters 3 and 4, I talk a bit about shame and parenting and attachment. And it was a difficult set of chapters for me to write because I was talking about my parents. My parents have read my book.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they read the last one too. They're troopers. And so I had to do some real thinking about how I grew up, the messages I internalized, how much of that came from my parents and how much of that came from the community at large. And I think one of the big things that a lot of people with religious trauma have to reckon with is, what do I do about my parents? What do I do about if the parents were the ones that got them into the religion in the first place, what do I do about their complicity in this and them introducing me to this? And so one of the things that I was able to uncover as I continued to reflect on my relationship with both of them is that we weren't alone. Our family was not doing this by ourselves. We were informed by a huge community of people that we were all interacting with. And especially like in the 90s, we were in church all the time. Other people were doing the childcare on Sunday mornings. Like there's this whole community of people. And then in addition to that, I went to private Mennonite school. So even if you went to the most progressive Mennonite church in the area, your kid might be getting taught Bible by someone that is not. So there's this whole community of people that will subscribe to a certain set of beliefs together, even as they have individual differences. That creates messages for a kid and for their nervous system. And I don't necessarily use this terminology in the book, but we talked about secondary trauma. There's also tertiary trauma or environmental trauma. And the idea, when I talk about this, I kind of talk about airports. Like you walk in and everyone's stressed. And similarly, if a body goes into a space in which everyone is stressed, it doesn't need a specific thing. It's just, oh, all the humans are stressed here. We must be in danger, going into stress mode now. And if that's not a good descriptor of how we're doing politically at the moment.
Wow. Yeah.
So,
and particularly when I think of growing up in a religious home, if one of the parents or both of the parents, if they're really running with this fundamentalist idea that they absolutely have to be in charge and they overdo any idea of discipline or punishment, then we really did grow up in a very unsafe circumstance.
Yeah.
And it's a lot for our body to carry with us. So that, I mean, even if we're just out in public and someone yells, we can immediately be thrust back into that. And I know for you folks, there's, gun issues also that we don't have in the rest of the world. like they are in the United States. So there's almost a balance. You have to be relaxed but vigilant, like, or ready, you know?
Yeah. hmm Yeah. And part of that is getting really minuscule about safety. It's not about like, am I going to be fine in the next 2 years? It's about, am I going to be fine in the next 30 seconds? And it's just a very different way of thinking, especially for people who have been perpetually anxious and have handled that anxiety by planning and thinking and projecting into the future and imagining and hoping that whatever they do will make it okay. It's really just the next 30 seconds as far as the nervous system preparing you. Like the fight flight is for 30 seconds. It's not for 4 years.
Right. And that's a big part of the issue for so many of us, that it's like the faucet has been left on this whole time. And so then we're getting these warnings, but is it because the house is on fire, or is it just that the toast is burning? And we
Yeah.
have to kind of figure out which one that is. So learning to feel safe in our own body, that is a big part of the work that you do, or just learning to read our own body and accurately determine the signals that we're getting.
Yeah, and I think there's some permission giving in this too, because for people that have grown up with substitutionary atonement, Jesus died for your sins, there's this suffering is currency mentality of you want to get something done, you need to suffer. If you want to pay for a past grievance, you need to do it through suffering. If you want to work toward a better future, you need to do it through suffering. And I think that ends up getting mapped onto our nervous systems in a way that, well, this political system is terrible, and there are a lot of people in a less privileged social position than me that are going to be horribly harmed by it. And how do I make that right? I stay in fight flight forever because that's suffering. And the longer I stay in fight flight on behalf of people that I am trying to help or trying to do my guilt penance for, the less effective I am at actually making change. Because a lot of times, especially in our current political environment, I mean, there are a lot of things we don't know, but one of the big things I have been hearing from politically savvy people is you got to call. Democrats, or in general, progressives, have been bad at calling. Conservatives are great at it. You got to call your people and you got to keep doing it. And that's a very consistent routine action. Routines are not things that sympathetic nervous system dominance is about, because it's for 30 seconds. So there is this, I think, utilitarian approach to, hey, actually, I'm going to make sure I'm good. I'm going to make sure I'm really good so that I am more effective at whatever it is that we need to do to face this.
Wow. Yeah. If we only have so much energy that to focus anywhere or to share with other people, we can feel when we're getting spread pretty thin and nothing's being done well because we're just kind of barely holding it together.
Yes. Yeah. And on the flip side, I think with the fight flight response, it ends up giving us too much energy. And then it's that same thing of like just shaking. And it's like, where do I put this? Where do I put it? And if we don't put it anywhere, which really for most of us is going to be movement of some kind to release it, because that's the empowering, I can do things to fight off tigers, thank you, kind of message that our bodies need, it'll go inward. It'll give us bad digestive stuff. It will keep us from sleeping. It will cause us to be irritable around people we love. And so making sure that we do take the time to physically release that stuff is essential.
And so how do you work with your clients around that? What sorts of ideas you run through with them, or do they present to you about how they can work that out of their body instead of holding it in there and putting it in unhealthy focuses?
Yeah, so we talk about a few different things. So I mentioned before being able to relax the body in the face of triggers, and that works at a certain energy level to be able to, that's kind of a maintenance thing of I'm trying to get myself back into parasympathetic dominance a little at a time, all the time. But there are times when we get triggered so far to the other end of the spectrum that it's just a little bit of relaxation is not going to be enough to get you all the way over. You've got to complete the stress cycle. And so that's when movement comes in. That's when and really, honestly, this should be routine anyway. Back to routines again. that movement, like walking, running, anything cardio related, is really, really helpful for getting that stuff out. And biking, like I could just keep going, swimming, anything
Dancing?
that works.
What about dancing?
Yes. Oh, yes. And it's really anything that communicates to the body, I have agency. I can move. I can push things. I can punch things, go kickboxing. Pound, I remember as a pastor, I had some anger issues for obvious reasons. And I remember going to Pound for fitness and just like weeping because I just needed the release so badly. Pound is, you use like drumsticks basically, and you're going on the beat with them. Like you're just, yeah,
Oh, how cool.
You clack them against each other, you clack them on the floor or whatever. So
are you in a group doing that?
Yeah. It was so you also get the synchronicity with other people, motor synchrony, which is really good for people. So yes, that is one thing that is really important. Knowing when is it I relax my body in this situation, and when is it I need to go get on my exercise bike for a bit and let this out. Yeah.
Well, what do you see a role in there also for art as being a way for the body to release or process traumatic experiences?
Yes. And for me personally, I would associate that with emotional expression. So one of the things that often happens for people in high control religion is that they learn to be afraid of their feelings. And so what often happens is that we get a double whammy. We get the feeling, which in and of itself isn't terrible, even if it's something like grief or anger or whatever. But it is something to process, it's something to go through. And then we also get the threat response on top of it that keeps it from coming out. That's just this, I am going to tense my muscles so hard that the tears don't come, or at least they eke out the sides, and then I get a headache. And being able to allow emotions to show up, especially in how we physically, visually express them in whatever form of art that happens to be. Mine is music. I will improv on piano or violin to let stuff out. It can be so healing. And it also signals to the body, oh, hey, these emotions aren't putting us in danger, actually. They're just releasing stuff.
Wow. And then I wonder too about for many of us who spent a long time in fundamentalist religious groups, there can be an element of moral injury that we suffer when we are told we must cut off loved ones who are not towing the line, loved ones, so shunning, really, I'm talking about. And that this takes a toll on us, obviously takes a toll on the person being shunned. It can have a devastating impact there.
Yes.
For the person who is being told by their spiritual teacher or whatever, pastor, even family members, that they must do this thing, that really can take a toll on our body as well.
Yes, absolutely it can. And it makes relationships scary. Even the good ones, or maybe even especially the good ones, because there's this sense of, well, where's the line? When am I going to have to completely abandon this person or be abandoned by them?
Wow. Yeah, and that really gets to the core of things, issues for so many of us. There certainly are abandonment fears. Again, when you're raised in fundamentalist religious families and communities where the danger is you will be cut off from everybody if you're cast into, hell or eternal torment, and there'll be no relief and you'll have no one to turn to. So when those are some of the earlier elements of religious teaching and training that we ingest as children, that's pretty scary. So I think most people who have grown up or been around the concept of hell, there is just going to be an element of trauma associated with that, because that's a terrible, abusive, toxic theological concept.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. So how can people get a hold of you?
Yeah, you can find me on my website, EmilyHedrickCoachingandConsulting.com. There's places on there to schedule a consult with me. I'll talk to anybody for 30 minutes.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's great. And your most recent book, again, is How to Treat Your Body Like a Sacred Text. And your earlier book is True Confessions of a God Killer, A Postmodern Pilgrim's Progress. I did just want to ask you about the title of your book, and Treating Your Body Like a Sacred Text. Can you just talk a little bit about that comparison?
Yeah. So the Bible was a big deal for me, as it was for many of us. And as a woman that ended up going into ministry, I learned early how to exegete, or to draw the meaning out of Scripture. And I then loved all of the learning I did about how to work with a sacred text in both undergrad and graduate school. And so much of it is learning how to not take the text literally, but really interrogate and ask questions of, where's this coming from? Who are the people that are being spoken to in this? And what was happening at the time that this was written? What role might this text have served? All of these questions. And then, of course, coming into this community care aspect of sermon creation and what does this mean for us today? And how can this be helpful for us now, knowing these strange connections we have to humans from thousands of years ago? How could this be helpful to us now? And so when I was initially doing my trauma training, I would encounter things like this, "Are you 100% safe right now?" question. Just be like, what are you talking about? And eventually I realized that so much of it is learning to communicate with our bodies. So much of trauma recovery is both listening and saying, what's happening, what messages are coming out of my body, but then also, how do I want to, from my conscious self, speak back? And one of the big concepts in trauma recovery is recognizing that feeling scared and being in danger are two different things. And to me, that's an invitation to not take the text or the messages literally, but to start asking questions. What's the historical context of this feeling? What's going on in the world today that might be contributing to the message I want to send back to my body? And so I take people through that learning process in the book, and basically invite people to become their own preachers. Like, the preachers of your childhood may have harmed you. Take back the power. You can preach, and you can preach to yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Wow. And then that also has to do with resilience and
Yes.
recognizing our capacity for resilience. And I feel like we were disconnected from that when we were part of fundamentalist religion, because the power always was outside of ourselves. But we are the ones with the power. And I think that just goes beautifully with what you were just saying. This has been such an interesting conversation. I think your book is great. I hope everybody gets a copy of it. I hope you help a lot of people. I'm sure that you will. Thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. I'm so glad to see you again, Janice.
Me too. And thank you for joining us for this edition of the Divorcing Religion podcast. Take care, everyone. We'll see you again soon.